Chapter 19 Forensics Anxious to share his new knowledge, Amon rushed into his house a short time later. Tamar was there talking excitedly with his mother, and both completely ignored him. "I have returned," Amon said loudly, thinking that they had not heard his entrance. Tabitha turned to her son just long enough to say, "God be praised for your safe journey." Then she turned back to Tamar, and they continued their gossip in whispers. Amon walked over to the table wondering why the women were not praying or teaching his younger brothers to meditate on the things of God. "What things do you speak of?" he asked. "Nothing you would be interested in," his mother said, then whispered even softer in Tamar's ear. Tamar giggled, and Amon thought he would die of curiosity. "Please," he said, "tell me what thing is so exciting that you ignore the Sabbath to speak of it." Tabitha and Tamar stopped and turned. "You will not like it," Tamar said. "I will not like it if you do not tell me," Amon replied. Tamar sighed. "Very well then, you asked. I was just telling your mother that the news has been passed up Jerusalem from house to house." Amon waited, but Tamar said nothing more. "What news?" he roared in frustration. "Amon," his mother scolded, "you raise your voice on the Sabbath?" Amon took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. "What news?" he said more quietly. Tamar grinned. "Was anointed in Bethany yesterday," she said. "He is only a quarter day's walk from this very place, and," she added, almost floating off the bench, "he is coming here, to Jerusalem, tomorrow." Amon knew he had forced Tamar to speak, and so tried not to let his disgust show in his words. "Who anointed this Jesus?" he asked. "No one but the high priest can anoint a king." "He was anointed by a humble servant girl," Tamar answered, "who is pure of heart and knows him to be the Messiah." Seeing the doubt on Amon's face, she added, "Who better to anoint a servant king than the lowliest of servants?" she asked. Amon did not answer, and Tamar didn't want to get into a debate anyhow. So she asked him a question she knew he would be anxious to answer. "And what of your talk with Gamaliel? Did he have any words of advice?" Amon did indeed get excited at the question, and sat facing Tamar on the bench. "Yes, yes indeed," he said quickly. Then, as he fingered the scrap of parchment from the market, he said, "He gave me the key to the entire mystery." The sun had barely peeked over the hill before Amon, Tamar, and Benjamin raced across the upper city. "The key to this mystery is that scrap of parchment in the folds of your tunic," Gamaliel had said. "Find the author of those words, and you've found the man or woman who can tell you the truth behind this matter." Such an idea had been floating around inside Amon's head ever since he'd been given the parchment, but until Gamaliel said it, the thought hadn't yet knocked on Amon's forehead. Gamaliel had said something else as well. "I'd wager all the grapes in my garden that the man who wrote this is a scribe in the temple." He stroked his chin for a few moments, then said, "Go and ask Joseph of Arimathea. He knows every scribe in Jerusalem." Amon knocked loudly on the door. "No man stands as straight and tall as Joseph of Arimathea," Amon thought when the man answered the door. Joseph's robes hung on him as straight as he stood, and looked as if a slave girl had spent a week pressing the wrinkles out of the garment. But Joseph had no slaves, Amon knew, only domestic help whom he paid well. Amon had met Joseph several times at Gamaliel's house, and now quickly told him the story as Tamar and Benjamin listened quietly. "Well then," Joseph said in his slow and methodical way, "let me examine this scrap of curiosity." Joseph took the parchment and held it first close to his face, then at arm's length. Presently he said, "Neri, son of Mattatus." He laid down the scrap and looked Amon in the eye. "A Levite, and personal aide to the high priest." "Aide to the high priest? Are you sure?" "I would almost wager on it," he answered, "but you must know beyond a doubt before you confront him." Amon thought for several moments, pacing across the wood floor of the large but unremarkable home. "How do I know beyond a doubt?" he asked the elder. "You must obtain a letter or document that you know Neri has written and compare the handwriting to this scrap," Joseph said, standing to pour himself a cup of water. He raised the pitcher to his three guests as an offer, but all three declined with a shake of their heads. "And how do I do that?" Amon asked. Joseph shrugged. "That will be a task for you to accomplish yourself. My way is not the intrigue and secrecy of espionage," he said. He took a long drink of his water, then added, "But this might be a good time to do whatever you do. Caiaphas will be busy making morning sacrifices for the priests. Neri will be recording each." Amon's mind spun into action. Seconds later, he jumped up and headed for the door. "Thank you, Master Joseph," he said, even as he pulled back the heavy wooden latch on the door. "I will repay your kindness when I can." "No need," Amon heard Joseph say behind him, but he was already out the door with Tamar and Benjamin on his heels. "Where are we going?" Benjamin asked. Joseph's house sat at the base of the viaduct that ran to the temple. In answer to Benjamin's question, Amon now raced up one of the stairways to the top of the bridge. "You will look for this Neri?" Tamar asked. "Yes, and when I prove he wrote the note to me, I will make him tell me what it means." "And how will you do this?" Tamar asked. Amon turned and grinned. "I will tell him. If he doesn't talk, I'll tie him up and make him listen to your stories of Jesus." Tamar laughed with Amon, then said, "Those stories may be your salvation." They were crossing the bridge to the temple when they heard shouts of excitement from below. Amon looked over the edge and saw hundreds of people pushing through the streets, headed toward the eastern wall of the city. "What's going on?" Benjamin asked as he hung over the edge of the bridge. "I do not know," Amon answered, "but we do not have time to find out." The three friends reached the temple, and Amon left Tamar and Benjamin in the court of women. Skipping the ritual baths, the court of Israel was filled with men, and Amon slid through the crowd, looking toward the large, horned altar that sat directly in front of the temple itself. There he saw Caiaphas making the sacrifices of the priests, preparing them for their new week of work. Amon scanned the courtyard for several minutes, then stopped cold. Sitting at the base of the altar was the thin man with the crooked nose and big, dark eyebrows who had stared at Amon the day before Tamar arrived. He was sitting on a short wall that was the side of the stairway leading up to the altar, and he was writing on parchments. Each time the high priest would make a sacrifice, the thin man would make notations on the parchment. Amon assumed he was writing down the names of the priests and the types of sacrifice made. Could this be Neri? Amon wondered. The thin man finished filing a sheet of parchment, and Amon watched him lay it on the ground by his side. There was a whole stack of such parchments, and Amon immediately formed a plan. He slowly worked his way to the other side of the stairway behind the scribe's back. Men were everywhere, watching the sacrifices, praying, or talking in small groups. Every once in a while a man would glance Amon's way and look at him curiously, but Amon would just bow his head and start praying, and whoever was watching him would lose interest. Amon figured this wasn't a wrong thing to do, since he really was praying each time, praying that whoever was watching him would look away. The high priest was nearing the end of his work, and Amon knew he must act quickly. He edged over toward the scribe, but kept his eyes on the altar. He was only 2 steps away from the scribe's back now, and stopped to make sure no one was watching. He carefully scanned the crowd and saw that all eyes were on the high priest, making the last of the sacrifices. Satisfied, Amon slowly bent at the waist and reached for the top parchment. Just before his fingers touched the document, he saw a movement out of the corner of his eyes. There, atop the wall, stood a temple guard watching Amon.